Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Korea Pro podcast. It is now Thursday, April 24th. It's a little bit before 5 p.m., and we have a lot of domestic news and geopolitical news to cover, so let's get to it right away.
When it comes to domestic politics, we won't really walk you through all the nitty-gritty, 11 to 8 to 4 sort of deal in the People Power Party or whatnot, because, that's too many. But general trends, there has been very interesting public opinion, public sentiment shifts in the past few weeks, especially from April 1st week to the 3rd week. All three major pollsters, NBS, Real Meter, and Gallup, it showed that the traditional, usual voter blocs are crumbling. Usually, when we think about South Korean electorate and when we are making predictions based on the polls, it's possible because there are usual suspects voting for usual suspects, right?
Demographics, the regions, the age.
Especially region. When it comes to TK region, for instance, Daegu and North Gyeongsang, it is almost certainly conservative. And when it comes to Honam, Jeolla region, it is almost certainly always progressive. But especially since Lee Jae-myung, the Democratic Party contender, sort of vowed that he will be the new, centrist conservative agenda sort of holding candidate and actually followed through with a lot of policy pledge adjacent sort of remarks and the speeches. There were shifts in TK region where actually there were this very significant amount of people that started backing DP and it continued for 2 weeks. And in also PK region, which is Busan, Ulsan, and South Gyeongsang, they also moved towards DP a little bit. It's not that much, but they still moved. On the other hand, the progressive voters in Honam region, there was a slight dip for a while, but it got back up. So the main takeaway from this is the traditional regional sort of ideological divide is blurring, but also the progressives are largely tolerating the shift that Lee Jae-myung is making. There's also there's also age cohort, interesting shifts recently. I had a good laugh about this with John when I saw this. People in their 60s, according to Real Meter, 11% point up for Lee Jae-myung support. That's very, very interesting. And even with people in their 70s, a significant amount, the percentage points went up. It did not stay that much, but still the spike itself is very interesting.
So the voting behavior, these blocs, are becoming a lot more fluid. It's not as fixed as it used to be, which makes our job a lot more harder. So it's getting harder to predict. But okay, so it's easy to understand why a lot of these conservative voters decided to at least briefly shift support for Lee Jae-myung because he's starting to talk like one of them.
Yeah, he talked about KOSP 5,000 mark pledge and all that.
Right. All the remarks that he used to make as a progressive candidate in 2017, 2021, they're out the window now.
He's not talking about anti-chaebol and getting rid of Samsung system anymore. He's not citing Bernie Sanders anymore. He's not talking about redistributed justice anymore. He's talking about K initiative.
So that's why it's easy to understand why the conservative voters shifted in their behavior. But you also mentioned that for a very brief length of time, at least, the progressive voters did not support Lee Jae-myung. Where did those votes go?
Right. It's not like they did not support Lee Jae-myung, but it went down very slightly for a second and then went back up. And that week was when he did the speech, the kickoff speech for his presidential run. And it does look like some of the more traditional, long-time progressives were slightly disappointed that he is not following through on what he pledged in the past, such as not just economic and trade sort of positions, but also he backtracked a lot on foreign policy and security issues as well, like, pursuing Korean Peninsula peace. He always mentioned that in 2017, 2021 kickoff speeches. But this time around, no mention of North Korea, no mention of China. Trump just as a geopolitical context. And he is really not talking about anything that he sort of pledged for before, like OPCON transfer, removing THAAD, removing Jisomia, whatnot. So people who still have party loyalty to the traditional ideas and the philosophy of the DP might have been disappointed. But then if you look at the mark where the support actually went back up, that was when Lee Jae-myung talked about regional development pledges like Busan, Ulsan, and Gyeongsang-namdo.
And Honam now.
And Honam as well today, right? So he is probably monitoring these poll shifts very, very closely. And the timing that when he reveals these regional development pledges, it's very closely tied to after there was a dip.
At the end of the day, everyone votes according to their pocketbooks. But now we have to move on very quickly. Jun Ha, you were paying close attention to this story, something about a previous president getting indicted. Could you walk us through that, please?
Which president?
Yeah, so former President Moon Jae-in, who finished his term in 2022, he's been indicted on bribery charges related to the alleged improper employment of his former son-in-law, surnamed Seo, at the budget airline Eastar Jet. And the prosecutors are claiming that Moon and his daughter, Moon Jae, received bribes in the form of salary and compensation paid to his former son-in-law, who was hired as an executive director in 2018, despite lacking the relevant experience.
So the timing of this indictment is, of course, quite suspect. We are in the middle of an election season. And for the most part, President Moon has really been out of the limelight, except for making some occasional remarks on Facebook once in a while.
He actually increased the level and the frequency of the statements recently.
And is it because of the elections, and is it because of these statements that someone is telling him to keep quiet?
Well, you know, the DP has condemned the indictment from the prosecutors as something that was very much politically driven.
I've been saying that for 3 years, right?
And Park Kyung-mi, who is the former spokesperson for the Blue House during Moon Jae-in, and Lee Jae-myung, the current presidential frontrunner for DP, was denouncing it as act of persecution against the previous Moon administration.
And lastly, on domestic politics, PPP finally figured out who the main 4 people to contend for the next round of primary will be. And interestingly, it's all men. Wow, what a surprise, right? The 8 people... the 8 people who made it to the first round of primaries, there was Na Kyung-won, Yang Hyang-ja, and others that we already talked about before. And in the final 24 hours, all the headline attention was on whether it will be An Chol-soo or Na Kyung-won, because Hong Joon-pyo, the former Daegu mayor, and Kim Moon-soo, the former labor minister who got viral after martial law for being very pro-Yoon, and An Chol-soo, who's running for the 4th time in a row in a presidential bid, and Na Kyung-won, who is more like she's a multi-term lawmaker with a very pro-nuclear and very pro-Yoon sort of rhetoric.
Very pro-alt-right.
Yeah, exactly. And also there's Han Dong-hoon, the former party leader who frames himself as a reformist of the conservatives now. And with these people, Han Dong-hoon, Hong Joon-pyo, and Kim Moon-soo, it was pretty clear that they were going to move on to the next round, considering their support. But An Chol-soo and Na Kyung-won was sort of...
pitting heads.
Yeah, and then An Chol-soo's pledges were, it's always all about, oh, look at how I'm very tech savvy and I'm, actually knowledgeable and well-informed, so on and so forth.
He does come from the tech world.
Right, and he aims at these people who want just, better global innovation, sort of competitive edge and stuff. And Na Kyung-won was aiming primarily at older generation voters who are very staunch pro-Yoon supporters. And at the end of the day, it seems like An won over someone who was targeting very alt-right groups.
Well, she was also born of the wrong gender, and
that is true.
And she doesn't have a parent who was a previous dictator, so she never really had much of a chance in this party.
Right, but at the end this weekend, there will be, I believe, the debates going on between the 4. Juna, can you fill us in?
So the debates will go on this weekend, as you just mentioned, with the PPP. With the DP, however, they will be finalizing their presidential candidate on April 27th. That's Sunday. And Lee Jae-myung, Kim Kyung-soo, and Kim Dong-yeon will be running for the final seat. Lee Jae-myung is currently surging within those polls.
Even more.
Yeah, recording, I think it was 89.9% accumulative from the first two regional primaries. So the last two will be this weekend.
So it sounds like there's no chance for the two Kims, it seems. Let's move on to the geopolitical tension that we saw in the past week. There are multiple topics under this category. John, can you walk us through them?
Okay, so lots of things are happening at once, but they're all interrelated. The first thing that happened, well, this didn't happen this week. What this happened was over the several past weeks, but what happened was that the U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, met with his Japanese counterpart, and during those meetings, this was toward the end of March, what the Japanese government had proposed was to form what they called a one-theater proposal. Now, to be fair, the Japanese government has not actually had this sort of discussion amongst the different cabinet ministers or different parties, and so this is not a fixed proposal. But if this is actually to be implemented, what it would do is that it would include the Korean Peninsula, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea into a single theater of war.
Ooh.
And so this will have severe implications. Now, it's quite easy to understand why Japan would support this. Japan,
or why they pledge it to the U.S.
Exactly. Japan is a little bit more overt in its opposition to Chinese expansion in the area. And so by having all of this into one single theater, they would be able to coordinate military responses between Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and the US. And while all of this would be into one theater, Japan, because of its geographic location, would be playing a support role at the back. And so it really benefits Japan in many different ways.
Have a cake and eat it too sort of situation, right?
Exactly. But for Korea, it's sort of a different story.
It's very different story.
Very different. For decades, the Korean Peninsula has always been a separate theater of war. The USFK's sole mission was to deter North Korea, not anything else. But especially because the Trump administration, what with Pete Hegseth and Elbridge Colby and Donald Trump as well, they're thinking that deterring China is now the main goal. And so when the Japanese defense minister made this proposal, they thought, hey, this seems like a pretty good idea. But what this will do for South Korea is that it will no longer be a separate theater. And in fact, it'll be just become one of the cogs in this machine. And so this will have a lot of roles, a lot of implications, especially if there is a Taiwan contingency. USFK will no longer be just based solely in Korea. They will likely be deployed into any sort of a cross-strait scenario.
In the next administration in South Korea, let's say that Lee Jae-myung wins, considering the current support. Will he be against this idea or not?
Well, that's the real big million-dollar question. We just talked about 2017 and 2021. During those times, Lee Jae-myung had very strong positions regarding the U.S. and Japan. He was anti-THAAD. He was anti-increasing South Korea's joint cost of defense sharing. He had these very strong positions, and so
anti-Japan.
And anti-Japan. And so in Tokyo and in Washington, there is still this prevailing belief that if Lee Jae-myung becomes the next South Korean president, he's going to be the troublemaker. And yes, we have talked about numerous times about how Lee Jae-myung has shifted his rhetoric to become the centrist conservative now. But there is this suspicion that if he becomes president, after he becomes president, he will revert back to his old ways. And so that's the concern in Washington and Tokyo. But this is just my take on this. Lee Jae-myung is not an ideologue. And I'm sure we can all agree on that.
Yep.
And because he's not an ideologue, when he becomes president, he's not going to be looking at things from a specific point of view, like from a specific partisan point of view. He's going to be looking at this as someone who is a South Korean leader and a South Korean nationalist.
Like, how do I make the deal?
How do I make the deal? And with the kinds of choices that Korea has, and Korea doesn't have any good choices, with Japan proposing this one theater policy.
Oops, Freudian slip.
And with the Chinese installing a steel rig in this contested waters between South Korea and China, and basically replaying what they've done in the South China Sea for the past several years now. There are a lot of concerns in Korea that China is now trying to build more quote-unquote artificial islands and try to take over, normalize, and eventually militarize waters that South Korea has long claimed as their own. And so with all of this going on, even if Lee Jae-myung becomes the next president, and even if he truly believed in the things that he said in 2017 and 2021, he might not be in the position to be able to oppose the U.S.
And that will actually risk a lot of fallout from the alliance and actual security cooperation and nuclear
If he
umbrella,
refuses,
whatnot.
yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like if the U.S. is approaching this, which sounds like if this is a true thing sort of actually going on, if the U.S. is doing cost-benefit analysis of repurposing USFK, Lee Jae-myung might as well just do his own way of cost-benefit analysis and say, look, this is what the costs that we are willing to sacrifice. Here are the benefits that we can reap out of it.
And so there will have to be negotiations between South Korea and the US. Now, South Korea does have some leverage. It's not enough to veto any sort of decision that comes out of Washington, but they will be able to say, here's what we're willing to give. What are you willing to give us in return? For example, one of the things that Trump has really hammered several times when it comes to South Korea is shipbuilding cooperation. After he became the president-elect, Yoon and Trump had a phone call, and without being prompted, Donald Trump talked about shipbuilding cooperation. And after the Constitutional Court upheld his impeachment, and when Trump had that phone call with Han Duck-soo, again, he talked about the same thing. So this is something that he really wants, and South Korea can use this to their advantage. And
But that's just one card.
That's just one card, but that's not the only thing. In any sort of Taiwan contingency, South Korea is vital. We have to go back to 2021. During the height of the pandemic, we saw a US C-17 Globemaster freighter. This plane carried a lot of COVID-19 vaccines and 3 US senators, and this Air Force plane landed in Taiwan. This was a big issue at the time. The Chinese government was really upset about it. But what's really notable about that plane was that that plane took off from Osan Air Base. And the Chinese government definitely noticed that. So in any sort of contingency in Taiwan, USFK and Korea, because of its pure luck or lack of luck in its geography, is vital, is essential. And so South Korea can say, here's what we can help you with. Here's what we cannot help you with. What are you willing to give us? And so South Korea is likely going to ask for several things. They're going to ask for a permanent deployment of Patriot missile batteries, which were not too long ago taken out of Korea and placed in the Middle East. They're going to ask for tariff exemptions, especially for South Korean firms that are currently still operating in China. And so it's going to be a lot of negotiation, give and take. What is the U.S. willing to give? What is the U.S. willing to take? Same thing for South Korea.
And the tariff task force team in the DP is currently led by Kim Hyun-jong, former FDA negotiator under Roh Moo-hyun administration, I believe. And Joon Ha wrote a profile about him.
Yeah, that's going out tomorrow, but just to brief you slightly, he was also the trade minister and the deputy director of the National Security Office under the Moon Jae-in administration. He was very much a key player in dealing with the Trump administration at the time, spearheading South Korean national interests in the Korea-US FTA in 2017, finally getting the signature from Trump and Robert Lighthizer in 2018. And if we can see Kim Hyun-jong coming back into the DP-led South Korean administration potentially in the first week of June, we can immediately see Kim Hyun-jong reaching out to his Trump administration contacts, which he has maintained since his departure from office in 2021. So it's an interesting couple of days.
Looking to stay informed about South Korea's fast-evolving political, business and cultural landscape? Join us on Korea Pro, the go-to resource for in-depth analysis expertly curated by top-tier professionals. And now you can pick the membership level that best suits your needs, thanks to our new subscription packages. Starting at just $199 annually, you can access daily analysis and our weekly podcast. Or try our premium membership package, which offers additional perks such as executive briefings, monthly reports and forecasts, networking receptions and event opportunities, as well as much, much more. To find the best fit for you, just head to signup.koreapro.org and become a member today.
Week ahead, like Joon Ha mentioned earlier, we will more clearly see who will be the main frontrunner for each party's will be. I mean, we know who the frontrunner of the DP is, but for PPP, we will be able to figure out who will be representing the party.
Or will it even be the acting president who will throw his hat in the last minute?
Right, that's the rumor so far. Some people are saying that if Kim Moon-soo wins the primary, he might actually join hands with Han Duck-soo, but that's just a rumor. So we'll keep an eye on that. other issues, we have a Seoul Circuit event coming up on April 30th evening. We have a couple of spots left. So if you want to join, it's about left, right, and everything in between. It's not just about politics, but political culture and the identities that shape South Korean these days. And it's the end of the month, so we will be publishing a month in review, and also a lot of economic and financial data marking the end of month will come out.
And all of this information will be sent to you by your email inboxes on Monday afternoon. So if you'd like to know more, please subscribe. Have a good weekend, everyone.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lee. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.